Today, let's make a coffee table that changes colors. So I had wanted to make a new coffee table for my house, but we really weren't sure what finish we wanted on it, but we had found a design that we liked at a local store, so I decided to make one that fit our room a little bit better than that one. I'm choosing to use some 2x8 rough sawn hemlock that I bought in upstate New York, and in order to kind of make it usable, I have to process it, which hopefully you don't have to do if you decide to make something like this. I run it through my big planer, which easily could have been done on a lunchbox planer, and then I cut it down to size before I go over and join the pieces to make sure that they'll fit up nice and tight. Now, this material is great, but it comes pretty wet, so I usually have to wait a while if I'm going to use it on a piece of furniture, and this stuff's been sitting around my shop for over a year now. I use this little trick on the joiner where you basically kind of bookend the two pieces that you want to join together and then push them through the planer joiner at once, and then that gives a perfect square reference edge and you get a really nice fit up. This works on cutting boards, it works on tabletops, so basically you just fold the pieces face to face and then run them through the joiner, and it doesn't matter if your fence is square, you'll always wind up with a nice joint. So once I get it all joined up, I kind of mark out my pieces, and then I'm going to use a domino to add a tenon that'll keep them all nice and aligned for the glue up. This is an unnecessary step, but it makes the tabletop stronger, and you could do it with dowels or biscuits, whatever method you would choose to kind of join up boards. With boards this heavy and knowing that they probably might have a little bit of moisture still in them, it's nice to use a tenon that'll just keep the whole thing strong. And honestly, the best part about using a domino is your glue up comes out almost perfectly flat because these things have such tight tolerance that they keep things from getting out of whack. I glue them up in two sections and then square it all up before I put it in the clamps, and I go ahead and leave it overnight. I used Titebond 3 on this, which is kind of my preference for a glue up. Anything larger than a cutting board gives you a little more time, and then I used the Paul Jackman clamp removal method to get all the clamps off. My favorite method for getting the actual dried glue off is just using a sharp chisel and kind of planing the top. It works really well, and I find it easier than trying to wipe off the glue while it's still wet. Then I can go ahead and measure it up so that I can square it up on the other side of the table. Before I do that, I have to fill some holes, and I'm using this Totalboat UV Cure epoxy. It's pretty cool. You use a little light to kind of cure it. It takes about 5 minutes, and it's better and faster than using a two-part in some of these cases because you can very quickly move through a project and not waste too much time. I also use some Starbond CA Glue to fill any of the really tiny holes. I'm going to be sanding this up from 120 grit all the way up to 320 to get a nice smooth finish. And I try to be nice and consistent so I don't have any big ripples in it. I square it up using my track saw, which is kind of just a convenience. I could push it through the table saw, but honestly, moving the track to the work is a lot easier than moving this big of a piece through a table saw. It needs to be perfectly square because I'm going to be putting it inside of an angle iron steel frame, and it's going to need to be able to flip over so you can get that two-sided effect. I also am going to see a little bit of the edge, so I want to take care to make sure that I sand it nicely so that it all accepts the stain evenly. Now, like I said, this is going to be a two-sided table, so I'm going to be using two different finishes. One is going to be a special walnut, and the other one is a pickled oak. I had this idea to do two different colors because when my wife and I were deciding on what we wanted, we kind of were going back and forth, and if you change a certain aspect of our living room, if you change the pillows or the slipcover on the couch, maybe you'd want a different color table. So I figured instead of just doing the whole thing in one color and being stuck with it, why not make it two colored, and then you could basically make the tabletop floating, and then you could kind of change it as you want. I never really seen anything like this, and I thought it'd be a fun experiment. Since I'm using the same kind of finish on both sides, I don't see there should be any issues in terms of warping or cupping. And basically all I'm doing here is applying the stain with a foam brush and then wiping off the excess in the direction of the grain. This stuff is very yellow or orange when it first goes on, but I found if I let it dry, it actually mellows out and looks really nice once it gets some varnish on it. I left it up on an angle overnight to dry so airflow could get to both sides, and the next day I shake up some Totalboat Halcyon Clear so that I can put it on as a top coat. I like this stuff. It comes in a bag. It's really easy to mix. You kind of just squeeze the bag and shake it up, and then you can apply a couple of thin coats, and you can get a lot done in a single day. I put a couple of coats on and basically wipe off the excess, and then as it's drying, flip it over and do the other side, have some paper towels down as like a pad, and basically I'm just putting this stuff on until I build up 3 or 4 coats, which is more than enough for an interior finish. I found this stuff repels water really well, and it stays super nice. It's easy to clean, and it's also easy to maintain. I really like it. Once it's dry for 12 hours, you can go ahead and use a light Scotch-Brite to kind of buff up the top and make it really, really smooth. At this point, the tabletop is pretty much done, and it's time to make the base. Now for the base, I'm going to be kind of ripping off the design I saw in the store, which is a box tube set of legs with a 1.5-inch angle iron frame that the tabletop will sit in. I'm using 2-inch by 2-inch 16-gauge box tube, and I'm cutting them up on my big miter saw. You could definitely get away with doing this on a portaband with an angle grinder or whatever. And it's funny because that's about a $8,000 saw, and the blade was dull, and my cuts wound up being totally inaccurate, which was super annoying. So I wound up having to recut and recorrect and had a big gap I had to fill. So just goes to show you that having expensive tools doesn't make anything that much easier. I will say, though, having a fixture table definitely helps. So I set up some stop pins here and basically make a jig that my legs can sit in, and then I know that both of these sets of legs are going to be exactly the same as long as they hit the same pins. So I tack everything together, fill whatever gaps I might have had there, and I can flip over the set of legs and basically weld the other side. You don't need a fixture table like this. For years, I would work on a piece of plywood and I would just basically screw wood down to make jigs, and it honestly worked really well. So having a fixture table is definitely nice and makes your life easy if you're doing this kind of work repetitively and especially for clients, but it's not something that you need. I set all my pieces in there, and then I use these hold down clamps to get everything locked in. And you can see I've got some metal shims against the pins on the back. Those are the Fireball tool magnetic shims, and I really like them. This 16-gauge tube can be kind of a pain in the butt to weld on miters because you've got a pretty thin corner, but once it's done, it looks really good. And then I'll go ahead and move to this angle, which is 1/8 inch thick, 1.5 by 1.5 inch, and then I cut all my angles on the bandsaw just the same. Basically here, I'm just making an inverted frame, and I set up some pins on this one as well, so I can tack the inside and weld the backside. Because the tabletop is going to fit inside, I want to make sure that there's no welds kind of disrupting that fit, so I just do a couple of light welds on the inside and then really do all my welding on the bottom and outside corners. This stuff's super easy to weld, it's very forgiving, and once it's all squared up, I just kind of fill in a little bit on the corners where I kind of burned in too hard, because I want this to look continuous once it's ground. I head over to the downdraft table, and then I use a ferred Victograin disc, which is by far my favorite way to bring down weld beads, and then I move up from that to a flap disc. The Victograin is great for stock removal, but it leaves some pretty heavy scratches, and you want to make sure that you get those out when you're going to paint, because if they're deep enough, you'll actually see them through a couple of layers of paint. Next, I need a way to attach the legs to this frame, so I grab some 1/4 inch stock and I cut some bars that would spread across inside the angle frame, and then the legs will be welded to that. Essentially, the whole table is just floating in here, so these need to be pretty strong, and I don't want them to flex. So I went with a thicker gauge material. In order to make the whole thing flat on the bottom, I spaced out the frame up by 1/8 of an inch, and you'll see now that the 1/4 inch is actually sticking out the bottom, and then I give it a nice full weld, and that'll be really strong to hold up the weight of the tabletop. In order to get the legs square to the base, I just use these heavy steel setup blocks and clamp everything to it, and then I go ahead and weld them to the base. Now, when I build a piece of furniture like this, I don't worry about grinding out those welds and making them look perfect. They're on the bottom of the table. You're not really going to see them, and as long as the welds don't look like total garbage, you can usually get away with it, and it's sort of accepted. Most pieces of furniture that you're going to buy, commercial furniture that is, they very rarely grind out any of the welds on the bottom, and this is going in my house, so, you know, the shoemaker's kid's shoes never look the best. Here I'm going to go ahead and square it up with an angle and a speed square, make sure everything's nice and perfect, and then I can go ahead and deburr and make sure there's no little weld BBs anywhere. I did use anti-spatter spray while I was welding to keep everything nice and clean, but you never know. I don't want anybody to get cut or anything when you're kind of moving this thing around. I'm using a Rust-Oleum self-etching primer and then also going through and grinding anything that was left on the top. And I really like this self-etching primer. It gives a great finish and it builds up pretty quickly. And usually you can get the top coat on in the same day. For the top coat, I'm just using a Rust-Oleum flat paint and primer in one. It works great, and I make sure to give this a couple of coats so that it builds up a nice resilient finish that isn't going to scratch easily. Now the last thing I do is I want to protect the bottom of the tabletop when it's inside the frame. So I actually use some black gaffer's tape to just make sure that there's some sort of a buffer between any of the metal and any of the wood on the tabletop. This is a simple little thing, and it definitely helps give a little padding, and it'll keep any metal from scratching the top. And I can bring it home and install it. So I put it in, and you can see the two sides of the tabletop are very different. And I started with the gray, and then I can basically flip it over and try the brown. Stewie seemed to like the gray, but I'll do a little test here with the brown, and we can see how that looks. Basically just flip over the top, and you've got a totally different look, and it totally changed the way the room looks. It's a really simple process, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I like the way the table came out, and if you did enjoy it, subscribe to my channel and follow me here on Instagram. Thanks.